In September 1865, a farm in Venango County, Pennsylvania, a property that had been worth perhaps a few $100s for its timber and its soil, sold for $2 million. 13 years later, the county commissioners bought it back for $4.37. That is the price of one meal in 1878, one tough beef dinner, for the entire farm, for the entire city that had been built on top of it. Between those two numbers, 2 million and 437, is the whole life of Pithole, Pennsylvania. A city of 20,000 people that was built from nothing, filled with hotels and theaters and banks and churches, connected by pipeline and railroad, lit at night by the very substance it pulled from the ground, and then emptied, dismantled, carted off, and returned to forest. The whole thing lasted about 500 days. There is no other American city like it, not because it boomed, lots of cities boomed, not because it busted, plenty of those too, but because it did both so fast and so completely that it barely left a mark on the ground. There are no ruins at Pithole. There are no old foundations to trip over, no crumbling walls. There are mowed paths through a hillside meadow and small signs that say where things used to be. Volunteers come out and cut the grass along what were once the busiest streets in western Pennsylvania. They call it mowing the streets. That's what's left. Mowed grass where Holmden Street used to run. But to understand what happened on that hillside and how fast it happened and what it meant, not just for Pennsylvania, but for the entire petroleum industry that was being invented in real time right there by people who had no idea what they were doing, you have to go back to January 1865 to a man named Isaiah Frazier and a forked stick. Frazier was a speculator from Butler, Pennsylvania, and he had already made a quick fortune, about $250,000, pulling oil out of Cherry Creek, a small waterway not far from where Edwin Drake had drilled the world's first commercial oil well in Titusville back in 1859. Drake's well had tapped oil at 69.5 feet. It produced maybe 20 barrels a day at its peak. Enough to prove a point to launch 1,000 imitators, but not enough to get rich on. Frazier wanted to get rich. He wanted the next strike, the big one, and he had a method for finding it that tells you everything about the state of petroleum geology in 1864. He hired a diviner, a man with a forked twig. The diviner led Frazier along Pithole Creek, a stream whose name came from fissures in the rock that leaked sulfurous gas, cracks in the earth that smelled, according to the historian Douglas Wayne Houck, like sulfur and brimstone. Early settlers believed they were looking at a portal to hell. The diviner's stick dipped. Frazier leased 35 acres from Thomas Holmden, a farmer, and started drilling. The first hole came up dry. The second one did not. On January 7th, 1865, the Frazier well blew in as a gusher, 650 barrels of oil a day, erupting from the earth with enough force that no one could control it because the blowout preventer hadn't been invented yet. That would take another 50 years. 10 days later, on January 17th, another well came in at 800 barrels a day. 2 days after that, a third. Each one a black geyser, spraying crude oil into the cold January air of northwestern Pennsylvania, and each one visible proof of a fortune waiting underground. The news traveled the way news traveled in 1865, by newspaper, by telegraph, by word of mouth along the Allegheny River, and the timing was extraordinary. The Civil War was ending. Tens of thousands of Union veterans were coming home with paper money in their pockets and no jobs waiting for them. Kerosene, refined from crude oil, was replacing whale oil as the nation's primary lamp fuel. Whale oil had climbed to $2.50 a gallon, and the whales were disappearing. Pittsburgh refineries couldn't get enough crude. Oil was trading at $8 a barrel, sometimes higher. Some sources put the price as high as $14 in late 1864. A single gusher producing 800 barrels a day. Do the math. That's $6,400 a day from one hole in the ground. So they came. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Veterans, speculators, teamsters, coopers who could make barrels, drillers who'd worked the earlier wells along Oil Creek, lawyers who smelled fees, gamblers who smelled marks. By the spring of 1865, the hillside above Pithole Creek looked like an invasion. In May, 2 men saw an opportunity in the chaos and seized it. Colonel A.P. Duncan and George C. Prather, Duncan was a Scotsman, Prather a local operator, bought acreage on the Holmden farm and laid out a city, 500 lots, 22 streets, 4 running east to west, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5 running north to south, Duncan, Mason, Prather, Brown, Holmden. Every street 60 feet wide except Duncan, which got 80. The lots went on sale May 24th, 1865. Half-acre plots sold for $3,000 each. Think about that price for a moment. $3,000 for a half-acre of hillside that had been forest a few weeks earlier. No roads, no sewers, no water supply, no buildings, just mud and tree stumps and the smell of crude oil and sulfur and the sound of steam engines pounding drill bits into rock 24 hours a day. $3,000. The average American worker in 1865 earned maybe $400 a year. And people paid it. They paid it because a week after the lots went on sale, Holmden Street was already lined with buildings under construction. Wood was the only material. Everything went up fast, without foundations. Walls slapped together from green lumber that would warp and split within months. The Astor House, Pithole's first hotel, was built in a single day. By July, 2,000 people lived in the new city. By September, 15,000. By Christmas, 20,000. In 7 months, a patch of Venango County wilderness, populated by rattlesnakes and porcupines, became one of the largest cities in Pennsylvania. What kind of city? A loud one, a filthy one. A city where the air tasted like sulfur and money. The streets were unpaved, mud in summer, frozen ruts in winter, and not ordinary mud, but mud saturated with crude oil, black and slick and ankle deep. Parts of First Street and Holmden Street had to be covered with planks and logs, corduroy style, just to keep wagons and livestock from sinking. A man named T.B. Whitaker wrote to his grandfather on July 30th, 1865, barely 2 months into the city's existence, describing the scene with the breathless certainty of someone who had arrived in the greatest opportunity of his life. He'd come for the oil, thousands had. The lush Venango County wilderness with its hemlocks and pines had been scraped away so fast that the tree stumps were still standing between the new buildings. Prices were wartime prices, inflated by scarcity and demand. A tough beef dinner cost $4.37, the same figure by coincidence that the entire city would later sell for. Firewood went for $7 a cord. Rents were extortionate and rose weekly. Every building with any space to spare rented it. Men slept in shifts, 3 or 4 to a bed that never cooled, because the night shift was heading to the wells when the day shift came home to collapse. There was never enough housing, never enough food, never enough clean water. Charles C. Leonard, a newspaperman, observed that with so much oil flowing from the wells and so many people crammed onto the hillside, clean water had become harder to find than petroleum. Holmden Street was the spine of it all, the main commercial artery where everything happened. By September 1865, if you walked the length of Holmden Street, you passed 57 hotels. You passed banks handling tens of thousands of dollars in transactions every day. You passed Isham's jewelry store and a restaurant called Terrapin Lunch. You passed the banking house of Prather and Wadsworth, and Dr. Christie's house on First Street, and dance halls and law offices and boarding houses and saloons and brothels. The red light district ran along First Street, and contemporary accounts compared it favorably to Dodge City's. You passed 3 churches, Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, all newly built. And if you stopped at the post office inside the Chase House Hotel, you were standing in the 3rd busiest post office in the state of Pennsylvania, behind only Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. It handled 5,500 pieces of mail a day. Now consider what that post office number really means. It doesn't just tell you about mail volume. It tells you about connection, about how many people in this city were writing to someone somewhere else, sending money home, begging for investment, reporting on leases, placing orders for equipment, writing letters to wives and mothers and business partners saying come quick, or send money, or don't come at all. 5,500 pieces of mail every day from a city that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. Pithole wasn't just a camp. It was a node in a national network, pulling in capital and labor and information at a rate that nothing in the country had ever managed before. And all of it, every hotel, every church, every letter, rested on oil, on the assumption that the oil underground was vast, perhaps limitless, that the Fraser Well was just the beginning, and that deeper wells and newer strikes would keep the crude flowing forever. Stocks in the United States Petroleum Company, the firm Fraser had founded with a Wall Street financier named J. Nelson Tappan, had jumped from $6.25 to $40 a share overnight when the first well came in. The New York Times called Pithole Tappan's Mushroom City. More wells followed: the Homestead, the Grant, the Twin Wells. By October 1865, the Pithole field was producing 6,000 barrels of oil a day, roughly two-thirds of the total oil production of the entire state of Pennsylvania. Two-thirds from one hillside. With that kind of volume, transportation became the defining problem of Pithole's short existence. The nearest railroad station was Miller Farm, 5 miles away on Oil Creek. There was no road to speak of, just mud. Deep, black, oil-saturated mud that swallowed wagon wheels up to the axles. 3,000 teamsters hauled barrels from Pithole to Miller Farm, their horses struggling through muck that never dried, and they charged for the privilege. $4 a barrel or more for the long haul. Over $1 a barrel even for the shorter runs. The teamsters had a monopoly, and they knew it. They set the price, and every producer who wanted to get oil to market had no choice but to pay. At $4 a barrel in transport costs, with oil prices volatile and production costs rising, the margins were being eaten alive. Samuel Van Sickle saw what everyone else saw, but he imagined a different solution. Van Sickle was an oil shipper, not a driller. He understood logistics. And he understood that what Pithole needed was not more wagons, but a way to move oil without wagons at all. In the fall of 1865, he formed the Oil Transportation Association and started laying pipe. 2-inch diameter wrought iron pipe in 15-foot welded joints running 5.5 miles from the Fraser Well area to the Miller Farm Railroad Station. 3 10-horsepower steam pumps built by Reed and Cogswell pushed the oil through. On October 10, 1865, Van Sickle's pipeline began pumping. 81 barrels an hour, 2,000 barrels a day, the equivalent of 300 teamster wagons working 10-hour shifts. The cost of transporting oil dropped from $4 a barrel to $1. It was, by any measure, a revolution. Oil that had been trapped in tanks on the hillside because there weren't enough wagons to move, it could now flow continuously, day and night, without a single horse or driver. Van Sickle was so encouraged that he soon laid a second pipeline parallel to the first. Ida Tarbell, who grew up in the oil region and would later write her famous history of Standard Oil, called Van Sickle's pipeline the most important event in the history of the oil regions after Drake's well itself. She was right. The pipeline didn't just solve Pithole's transportation problem. It invented a technology that would become the backbone of the global petroleum industry for the next century and a half. Every barrel of oil that moves through a pipeline today descends from those 5.5 miles of 2-inch iron pipe. The teamsters, naturally, were furious. Their livelihood was being destroyed by a buried tube. What followed became known in the region as the Pipeline War. Under cover of darkness, teamsters and their allies went after the line with pickaxes and wrenches, tearing apart joints, cracking pipes, spilling oil into the dirt. They ripped up sections and scattered them. They threatened Van Sickle and his workers. It was industrial sabotage on a scale the oil region hadn't seen, and this was a region that had already seen plenty of rough behavior. Van Sickle hired armed guards, some accounts say Pinkerton agents, to patrol the route around the clock. Guards walked the line day and night, rifles ready, watching for movement in the darkness along those 5.5 miles. The sabotage slowed, then stopped. The teamsters dispersed. Most of them left Pithole entirely. The future had arrived and it was underground. But here's what makes the pipeline story more than a triumph of engineering. The pipeline worked so well and moved so much oil so cheaply that it put thousands of men out of work at a single stroke. 3,000 teamsters, their horses, their wagon builders, their blacksmiths, their feed suppliers, an entire economy built on hauling barrels through mud, gone, in the same city, at the same time. Van Sickle's innovation was brilliant and necessary, and it hollowed out one of Pithole's largest employment sectors in a matter of weeks. The pipeline was barely operational when a young Cleveland refiner named John D. Rockefeller began studying it carefully. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that whoever controlled the transport of oil controlled the price of oil. Within a few years, he would build Standard Oil into a monopoly, partly by dominating pipeline networks. The seed of that empire was planted at Pithole Creek. While the pipeline was being laid and guarded, Pithole was reaching its cultural peak, and the speed of that cultural peak is almost as astonishing as the speed of the oil strike itself. On September 5, 1865, the Pithole Daily Record began publishing, a real daily newspaper for a city that was barely 4 months old. The Record covered oil prices, lease transactions, fires, crimes, and the daily gossip of a city that was creating itself in real time. 12 days later, on September 17th, Murphy's Theater opened its doors. It was the largest building in Pithole, 3 stories, 1,100 seats, a 40-foot stage, an orchestra pit. The chandeliers were by Tiffany, in a city built entirely of rough lumber without sewers or clean water, a city where the streets were black mud and the air smelled of crude and sulfur. Someone built a theater with Tiffany chandeliers. That someone, the Murphy for whom the theater was named, understood something essential about boomtowns. People with money in their pockets want somewhere to spend it, and entertainment is as much a necessity as food when you're working 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions. Pithole wasn't just a work camp. It was a city trying to become civilized at a pace that civilizations don't normally attempt. In December 1865, the Shakespearean tragedienne Eloise Bridges came to Murphy's Theater and performed Lady Macbeth. Think about what that scene looked like. Outside, derricks crowded the hillside, their steam engines clanking and hissing. Wagons still clattered along the rutted streets. The pipeline had not killed all the hauling. Not yet. Oil fires had already become a regular hazard. The big wooden storage tanks leaked and sparked. Rats were thick. Clean water was scarce. As Charles C. Leonard, who wrote for the Pithole Record, put it, there was so much oil flowing and so many people that clean water was difficult to obtain. And inside Murphy's Theater, Eloise Bridges was delivering the sleepwalking scene, out damn spot, in a city that was essentially one enormous spot. That December was the zenith. On any given day in late 1865, Pithole was processing more economic activity per square foot than almost anywhere in America. Oil leases changed hands in saloons and hotel lobbies for thousands of dollars, sometimes several times in a single day. Each buyer convinced that the lot he was purchasing sat above untapped wealth, and each seller privately calculating that the best days were behind him. The banking houses along Holmden Street handled transactions in cash, greenbacks, and gold, because the city had no established credit system and no history. Everything was present tense. There was no past to borrow against and, as it turned out, no future to invest in. The Danforth House, one of Pithole's luxury hotels, opened on Christmas Eve, 1865, at the corner of Holmden and First Street. The Chase House was already operating, handling the post office on its ground floor. The Bonta House stood across Pithole Creek in a neighborhood called Prather City. Pithole was officially incorporated as a borough on November 30th. A railroad, the Oil City and Pithole Branch, built under the charter of the Clarion Land and Improvement Company, reached the city on December 18th, a 10-mile standard gauge line running south to connect with the broader network. The city had its own foundry and machine shop. It had its own fire department, which it desperately needed. The streets, people said, were the first in the world to be fully illuminated by petroleum, the very fuel that had built the city lighting its nights. 20,000 people, 54 hotels, a Tiffany-lit theater, a railroad, the world's first oil pipeline, a post office that outpaced every city in Pennsylvania except the 2 largest, and all of it less than a year old. But the seeds of collapse had already been planted, and they'd been planted before the first Tiffany chandelier was hung. In August 1865, a full month before Murphy's Theater opened, a full 4 months before the Danforth House Christmas Eve debut, the Homestead well stopped flowing. It didn't slow down, it stopped. One day it was producing oil, and the next day it wasn't, and it had to be pumped mechanically, which reduced its output dramatically. This was the first time anyone at Pithole confronted a terrifying possibility that the oil underground was not an ocean, that it was, in the word one contemporary account used, more like a puddle. Nobody wanted to hear it. The Homestead well was just one well, after all, and there were dozens more producing. But it was a signal, and the people paying closest attention, the ones with the largest investments, took notice. In November 1865, while Eloise Bridges was still performing and the Danforth house was still being finished, the Fraser well itself quit flowing. The well that had started it all, the gusher that had erupted 10 months earlier at 650 barrels a day, done. Now the numbers began to tell a different story. In October 1865, Pithole's wells had produced 6,000 barrels a day. By January 1866, that number was down to 3,600. By the end of 1866, 1,800. By 1867, 1,000. The decline wasn't gradual. It was a staircase, each step a jolt downward, and every step drove another round of producers, speculators, and merchants toward the exits. The geology was merciless. The oil at Pithole came from what the drillers called the third sand formation, a productive layer, but a thin one, and the reservoir pressure that had driven those early gushers was finite. Once the pressure dropped, the wells had to be pumped mechanically, which cost money and produced less oil. Once the reservoir was depleted, no amount of pumping would bring it back. Pithole had produced spectacularly because its wells tapped a concentrated pocket of high-pressure crude, not because it sat on top of an underground sea. The city was built on the assumption of abundance. The geology delivered a windfall. Meanwhile, new oil strikes were being made elsewhere in Venango County and beyond. Petroleum Center, Pleasantville, other hamlets along Oil Creek. Drillers moved where the oil moved, and the oil had moved on from Pithole Creek. Each new strike somewhere else was another reason to pack up and leave. The oil price collapsed in tandem. From $8 a barrel at the peak, crude fell to $2.50. Some accounts put the bottom even lower. The margins that had made fortunes vanished. At $2.50 a barrel, after transport and drilling costs, there was nothing left. And then the fires came. Fire had always been part of life at Pithole. Wooden buildings, open oil tanks, gas leaking from uncapped wells, steam engines throwing sparks. Lightning strikes ignited storage tanks with regularity. 17 major fires struck Pithole during its short existence, each one burning wells and buildings and oil. But in 1866, the fires became catastrophic. On February 24th, a house caught fire, and strong winds drove the flames across Holmden Street. In 2 hours, most of the main commercial district was destroyed, the same street that had been lined with shops and hotels just months earlier. The street where 5,500 letters a day went through the post office, reduced to smoking timber and ash. Buildings were rebuilt because people still believed. But the rebuilding was slower now, more tentative. The insurance companies, to the extent they existed at all for a city this new and this combustible, were not writing new policies. Then, on August 2nd, the worst fire in Pithole's history broke out at well number 43 on the United States Petroleum Company lease. An engineer named H. Lopez was running the engine on wood instead of gas that morning. The sucker rods were being pulled for repairs, when a spark from the firebox caught the gas escaping from the wellhead. In seconds, the derrick was a torch and the oil in the adjacent tank was ablaze. The flames spread with, as the Pithole record reported, fearful rapidity, jumping from well to well, tank to tank, lease to lease, racing through the oil-soaked ground and the wooden infrastructure as if the entire hillside had been designed as kindling. 27 wells were destroyed. 12 to 13,000 barrels of oil burned. The fire consumed every well on the United States Petroleum Company's tract and all those on the neighboring Summer and Pratt tract across the creek. The property loss was estimated at $135,000, which in 1866 was a staggering sum for a city that was already hemorrhaging people and money. The fire of August 2nd didn't kill Pithole. What killed Pithole was the oil running out. But the fire made sure everyone knew it was time to leave. By December 1866, the population was down to 2,000 from a peak of 20,000. The departure was almost orderly, not a panic, but a steady, methodical evacuation. People didn't just leave. They took the city with them. Buildings in Pithole had been built without foundations, which meant they could be dismantled, loaded onto wagons, and reassembled somewhere else. And that's exactly what happened. Hotels, houses, offices, shops. They were pulled apart board by board and hauled to whatever the next boomtown happened to be. Some buildings were loaded whole onto sledges and dragged across the frozen ground in winter, since the roads were impassable by wheel in mud season. Think about what that looks like. A city disassembling itself, walls coming off frames, roofs lifting, the skeleton of a building standing exposed for a day or two before the lumber is stacked on a wagon and the wagon rolls away and the lot returns to bare dirt. It happened in reverse of how it was built, but just as fast. Entire blocks disappeared in weeks. The newspaper, the Pithole Daily Record, relocated to Petroleum Center in July 1868, where it became the Petroleum Center Daily Record. Same paper, different address, as if a newspaper were just another portable structure. In August 1868, two of Pithole's defining buildings, the Chase House and Murphy's Theater, were sold and physically moved to Pleasantville, a town a few miles away. The Tiffany chandeliers traveled with them. The 1,100-seat theater that had hosted Shakespeare was broken into sections, loaded onto wagons, hauled over the hills, and rebuilt in a town that still exists. Pithole's grandest building simply walked away. Here is a detail worth pausing on. Ida Tarbell's father built the family's house in Titusville, the Italianate-style home where the future muckraking journalist grew up, using lumber salvaged from the Bonta Hotel at Pithole. The skeleton of one city became the walls of a house in another. That's how Pithole dispersed, not into ruin, but into other things. Duncan and Prather, the two men who had laid out the city, sold their interests before the collapse. Prather split an estimated $3 million with his two brothers and moved to Meadville. Duncan went home to Scotland with his fortune. They had timed it right, bought low, sold high, and walked away clean, which is the thing that separates the winners from the losers in a speculation game. Everyone who stayed too long, who held their leases one season past the peak, who believed the wells would come back, they lost. The 1870 census recorded 237 people living in Pithole, from 20,000 to 237 in 5 years. The borough charter was annulled in August 1877. The Catholic Church was disassembled and moved to Tionesta in 1886. The Methodist Church lingered, barely maintained, and was finally torn down in the 1930s. And the Danforth House, the luxury hotel that had opened with such optimism on Christmas Eve 1865, at the corner of Holmdon and First, sold as firewood for $16. There is a story that belongs alongside Pithole's, and it involves a man whose name is far more famous, but whose connection to this hillside is almost never mentioned. In late 1863, a year before the Fraser well blew in, a young actor named John Wilkes Booth was performing at the Cleveland Academy of Music. Booth had been reading the newspaper reports about the oil boom in Venango County, and he convinced two friends, John Ellsler, the theater manager, and Thomas Mears, to join him in an oil venture. They called it the Dramatic Oil Company. In January 1864, Booth traveled to Franklin, Pennsylvania, and purchased a lease on the Fuller farm. His well, the Wilhelmina, produced 25 barrels a day, decent but not spectacular. At $8 a barrel, that was $200 a day, but the costs kept climbing. The Wilhelmina was temperamental, prone to breakdowns, constantly needing maintenance. Booth tried to increase production by shooting the well, detonating black powder deep in the hole, a crude precursor to hydraulic fracturing. It backfired. The explosion collapsed the well bore and killed the flow entirely. By the summer of 1864, Booth had sunk over $6,000 into the oil business, about $92,000 in today's money, and had nothing to show for it. He also owned a share in the Homestead well on Pithole Creek, but in July he sold that too, frustrated and broke. He transferred his remaining oil interest to his sister Rosalie and his mother. He left Pennsylvania for Washington. In a letter, his business partner Joseph Simons urged him to come back, expressing optimism about the company's prospects. Booth ignored the letter. He had begun scheming against President Lincoln. The kidnapping plan became an assassination plan. On April 14, 1865, he shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater. 12 days later, Booth himself was dead, cornered in a Virginia tobacco barn by Union cavalry. 2 months after that, the Homestead well on Pithole Creek struck oil, 500 barrels a day. The well Booth had sold for nothing made fortunes for the men who held it. If Booth had waited, If he had been a little more patient, a little luckier, a little less consumed by whatever dark ideology drove him south, he might have been rich. He might have stayed in Pennsylvania and become one of 1,000 forgotten oil men. Instead, he became the most infamous assassin in American history, and the well he abandoned gushed without him. Nobody can know what would have happened, but the coincidence of timing is so precise and so cruel that it feels like something a novelist would invent and an editor would cut for being too neat. Pithole's story doesn't end with the last resident leaving. It ends in a way with what came after, with how the city's brief existence changed things that outlasted it by 160 years. The towns that received Pithole's lumber and Pithole's people survived. Pleasantville got Murphy's Theater and the Chase House. Titusville got the Tarbell family and the lumber from the Bonta Hotel. Petroleum Center thrived for a while on newer wells and inherited Pithole's newspaper. Oil City grew into a real city. The wealth extracted from Pithole's hillside, from the oil itself, and from the leases and the lots and the services sold to 20,000 frantic people, flowed outward into the region and beyond. Prather took his $3 million to Meadville. Duncan took his to Scotland. Investors in New York and Philadelphia and Boston collected their returns or wrote off their losses. The money didn't disappear when Pithole did. It just moved, the way the buildings moved, reassembled elsewhere into different shapes. The pipeline that Van Sickle built in 5 weeks in the fall of 1865, 5 weeks, 2 inches of iron pipe, 5.5 miles, became the model for the infrastructure that now moves oil across continents. The wells at Pithole proved that oil could be found outside the narrow valleys of Oil Creek, up in the hills, in terrain no one had previously thought worth drilling. The Homestead and Grant wells punched into what the drillers called the third sand formation, deeper than anything attempted before, and showed that there were multiple producing layers beneath the surface. The boom and bust cycle that Pithole lived through at hyperspeed became the template for every oil town that followed. Spindletop, the Permian Basin, the Bakken, the same pattern of euphoria and overproduction and price collapse and abandonment played out at varying speeds but always recognizable. And the fear that Pithole's sudden death planted in the minds of oil men, the fear that any field, no matter how productive, could simply stop, drove John D. Rockefeller and others to build refining and pipeline empires designed to survive the exhaustion of any single source. Rockefeller watched Pithole happen. He was in Cleveland, 26 years old, already building his first refinery, and he saw a farm sell for $2 million, and then he saw the whole city on top of it evaporate. He concluded that the upstream side of the business, drilling, producing, was too volatile to control. The money was in refining and transportation, in being the man who processed and moved the oil, not the man who pulled it out of the ground. Standard Oil was built on that insight, and Pithole was the case study. The men who got rich at Pithole were not the men who drilled. They were the men who bought and sold, Duncan and Prather, who timed the real estate market, and the men who built infrastructure, like Van Sickle, whose pipeline outlived the wells it served. The drillers went broke when the oil stopped. The middlemen went home wealthy. 3.5 million barrels of oil came out of the Pithole field in total. That's how much the ground gave up before it went dry. In 2024, the world consumed roughly 100 million barrels of oil per day. Pithole's entire lifetime output would last the modern world about 2 minutes, but those 3.5 million barrels, extracted over 2 years from a hillside in northwestern Pennsylvania, generated enough wealth to build a city, enough innovation to transform an industry, and enough wreckage to teach a generation of investors what happens when you bet everything on one hole in the ground. The lesson was not that oil was unreliable. The lesson was that any particular source of oil was unreliable, and that the smart money built systems designed to survive the death of any single well. Rockefeller learned that lesson. The oil industry learned that lesson. Pithole paid the tuition. In 1957, a man named James B. Stevenson, the publisher of the Titusville Morning Herald, bought the Pithole site for $6,000. He cleared the brush, which by then had been growing for the better part of a century. He found objects in the dirt, small things, artifacts of daily life in a city that had been taken apart and carried away. He donated the land and the objects to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission in 1961. A visitor center went up in 1972. Pithole was added to the National Register of Historic Places on March 20th, 1973. Today, the Visitor Center has a diorama, a scale model of Pithole at its peak, more than 200 miniature buildings, 500 tiny figures, all arranged on the slopes above a tiny Pithole Creek. There's a short film. There are recovered artifacts in glass cases, bottles, tools, hardware, the small debris of daily life in a city that people carried away plank by plank. It is a model of a city that existed for 500 days and then became a model of itself. Outside, the mowed paths run along the hillside. You can walk Holmden Street, or where Holmden Street was. You can stand at the corner of Holmden and First, where the Danforth House opened on Christmas Eve and later sold as firewood for $16. You can walk down to the creek and look at the spot where the Fraser well erupted, where Isaiah Fraser's diviner felt his forked stick dip, where 650 barrels a day came roaring out of the ground and announced to the world that there was wealth under this hillside, unimaginable wealth, enough to build a city in months and fill it with theaters and chandeliers and post offices and churches and 20,000 people chasing the same dream. The grass is cut short. The trees press in at the edges. There's a historic pump jack, a few interpretive plaques, the faint slope of the land suggesting where buildings once stood. In October, they do lantern tours, volunteers in period costume, walking the mowed streets after dark, playing the parts of people who lived here when the oil was flowing and the money was good and the future seemed like it would never run out. The creek still runs. The fissures in the rock that gave Pithole its name, the sulfurous cracks that the early settlers took for a gateway to hell, are still there somewhere, on private land, off limits. The smell, presumably, is the same. Holmden Street is 1,200 feet of mowed grass and nothing else. The city came and went so fast that the earth barely remembers it was there.